Good morning. Well, that was okay, but not great. So, good morning. I know we've had a significant snow event this morning already. And so, hang on just a second. Let me get this thing turned on. And so, I'm glad that all of you are here. There are a number of people in the congregation that are traveling. We have young adults that have gone to the Gulf. You have my permission to beat them when they come back because it's a lot warmer and nicer there than it is here. And then Adam is out of town, so I get the opportunity to preach, and that's always a good thing for me. I hope it's a good thing for you this morning. This morning we're going to be talking about unlikely people. How many of you don't have to raise your hand, you can if you want to, but you don't have to. How many of you think of yourself as being unlikely as a person that God would use to do something really important? Yeah, we've got a few that have already put their hands up. I think almost all of us have that feeling at least sometime in our life that when it comes to doing work for God, it's good work that we do, but it's not all that important. But if you're teaching young minds almost as soon as they can understand our language, that's really important, especially if you're teaching them about Jesus and about God and about how to live in this world that we live in. If you're one of the men who is giving the emblems to us as we're remembering Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, and you're helping us to focus on the things that really matter at that particular time, that's important. If you're the guy that changes the tiles when they get damaged or dirty down in the educational wing, that's important. In fact, any work you do for God is going to be important. It's important to Him. It's important to us as a congregation. It's important to our community. And when we look back through history, especially biblical history, we see that God has used some of the most unlikely people to accomplish His goals. There's Abraham, for instance. When we think about Abraham, God promised him, I'm going to make you a great nation. What did Abraham do? He laughed. His wife laughed because he was an old man. I mean, he was close to 100. And here God is promising him, you're going to have a son, and I'm going to turn this son into a great nation. And then on top of that, he was living down in Ur of the Chaldees, and it was a long way from where he was living to the place that God was sending him to. He had never been there, probably never even talked to anyone who knew anything about this place. And yet God said, I want you to pick up everything that you have. And he was a pretty wealthy man even at that time. And I want you to move way up north up here to the promised land that I'm going to give you. Excuse me. And Abraham just picked up and went. And then we think about Moses. Now, Moses was a murderer. It was for a good cause, yes. He had witnessed the mistreatment of his own people. Of course, I'm not sure that Moses knew at the time that that was his own people. He had been raised as an Egyptian heir to the throne. But yet he saw an injustice being done, and he rectified it with killing someone. So he was a murderer, any way you look at it. And because he was a murderer, that made him a fugitive. He had to go off into a different land and hide for a good long while. Now, Moses, by his own admission and God's agreement, was not skilled in any kind of diplomacy or statecraft. Yet God said to him, I want you to go back to the place where you murdered that guy, and we'll hope no one remembers that. And I want you to talk to the Pharaoh, who is the head guy there, and I want you to tell him to let this entire nation of slaves go. Now, at that time, almost the entire world depended on slave labor. Not much got done if it wasn't done with slaves. So your Pharaoh, head of Egypt, and this nobody from Midian comes up and says, I want you to turn these people loose and let them go back to their homeland. And of course, we all know the story about how there were the 10 plagues and all those things that went with that. And there was a reason for that. God was trying to demonstrate his power. God was trying to demonstrate his understanding of human nature. God was trying to demonstrate that he was in control. He needed to demonstrate it to the Egyptians and Pharaoh in particular, but he also needed to demonstrate it to Moses and the Israelites. Because not only was he asking Pharaoh to let them go, he was asking them to go. Now, they'd been there for 400 years or more. They didn't know anything else by this time. Everyone who had come out of the promised land was dead. And so here's God saying, I want you to pick up and go north again. And you can imagine how that went over in people's minds. And so God used this murdering fugitive to be the spokesman and the leader. Now just put yourself in that position. You're an Israelite in Egypt, and this guy comes and says, I'm going to take you back to the promised land. And you're thinking, yeah, right, sure. And then, of course, there's Gideon. Gideon was from a poor family. And it says in the text that he was the least of that family. Now, he was using least in that good old country sense of least. It was youngest or smallest, or maybe both. So here God is, not using some big strapping guy who has proven himself in battle over and over again, but the smallest, youngest of a poor family, and he says, I want you to go defeat this other nation. And then he gives him probably the smallest army that anybody has ever had in order to accomplish the purpose. And of course, we all know the story, and it did happen just that way. But I want you to notice something else about Gideon that makes him so unlikely. When God said, I want you to do this, Gideon's first response was, show me a sign. He needed convincing. And I'd venture to say that almost every one of us is that same way, aren't we? God calls us to do something, and we say, I need a sign. I need some convincing. I'm not sure that the call that I received was genuine. It might have just been voices in my head, you know, that kind of thing. But as with all of these other people, when God calls, we should listen. He says, be still and know that I am God. We have to believe in him. We have to trust him. And when he calls, we have to go. But then we think about David. Now, David is arguably the most famous king in the Old Testament. But when God called him, David was the most unlikely of all the people that he could have called at that particular time. David was from a big family. All of his brothers were fighting in a very important war against the Philistines. Now, while his brothers were out fighting, David is a shepherd. He's tending to the sheep, and he's just a young boy. But God used him not only to be anointed king, but to kill this giant and turn the tide of that war. And then there's Ruth. Now, Ruth is a completely different story altogether. When you start talking about unlikely people, Ruth is most likely the most unlikely. First of all, Ruth was female. Let me put the thing back on. Now, in the Bible, I hate to say this, and we're in this modern time when we have the Me Too movement and the women's movement and other things going on, and that's okay, that's fine. We should be thinking about those things. But females did not take a prominent public role back in the days when Ruth was living. To compound it, she was foreign. She was from Moab. And so she wasn't even a Jew, not directly anyway, which meant she was Gentile. God usually didn't use Gentiles to accomplish his ends with the Jews, at least not before New Testament times. And then there's the fact that she's a widow. Now, widows under Old Testament law didn't have much in the way of rights at all. Their property belonged to the males of the family. And so even if they were allowed to live on the property and in the home that they had built, it still belonged to someone else. They were dependent on the largesse of whoever would support them in order to have support, because they didn't work outside the home, and they weren't allowed to do a lot of the things that men were allowed to do. And so being a widow, Ruth is exceptionally unlikely to accomplish anything publicly for God. The other thing about Ruth is, when we look at the entire book of Ruth, and she's only one of two women who have had a book devoted to her in the entire Bible, we find out she didn't have any special skills of any kind. We don't read where she was a seamstress or a tent maker or any of the other things that we read about some of the women in the New Testament and the Old Testament. We don't read about her being a judge. She wasn't a princess or anything like that. She was just a poor Moabite widow who ended up having to glean in somebody else's field because she didn't have anything or any real skills that she could take to the marketplace. Now, that's an important idea for us to file away in our minds, is that Ruth didn't have any special skills. But she was from Moab, and Moab is a place that's not particularly hospitable. Genesis 19:37 tells us that Moab is the name of the son that Lot had in an incestuous relationship with his firstborn daughter. After Sodom and Gomorrah, and they were out on the plains, and they had run up into the mountains and were hiding in the caves, the daughters thought it would be a good thing if they would have children, because that's how you carried on the family name. Well, there were no men around for them to have children with, so they decided to have one with their father. And Moab was the son that was born, or one of the sons that was born out of that union. Ammon, the land just above Moab, was the other son that was born out of the union. Moab had an on-again, off-again relationship with Judah, which was just across the Dead Sea from it. Most of the time, it was friendly, but not always. And so it was a kind of hit or miss thing. Just so happens that at the time of Ruth, there were pretty friendly relationships going on. Another thing about Moab is the soil there held water, and still does hold water, better than the land over where Judah is. Not only that, the rains were heavier. And so Moab would more likely have good crops and escape famine when Judah and all of Israel was struggling with that. So there's Moab, right down there near the bottom of the map on the right-hand side. And as you can see, you've got the Dead Sea between it and Bethlehem. This is what the topography looks like today. You can see the little green spaces, excuse me, all down through between the rocks and the hills. But that's pretty much how it looks all over everywhere. And so it's not a real fertile place, and even in the time of Ruth, it was not particularly more fertile then than it is now. But back to Ruth. Most of you remember the story of Naomi and Ruth. Ahimelech was in a time of famine. He was a Jew, and so he came through the lands above and down into Moab here in order to live during the time that the Israelites were starving. And so Ahimelech died, but before he died, he had two sons. And we're told that this is, thank you, sir. We're told that this is in the days when the judges ruled. Now, history tells us that was around 1000 BC. Could have been as late as 1250 BC, but it was definitely around 1000. And we're also told that they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. That just means that they were from the land of plenty. And isn't it ironic that these people left the land of plenty to go to Moab because they were having a famine? If you can't see God's hand in that, what can you see? But literally, these people were from the fruitful land. And when you look at their names, the boys that were out of the union of Ahimelech and Naomi are frail, weak. That's their name. That's what their names mean. And they lived there about 10 years. After having married Ruth, they died. And so here's Ahimelech that's dead. Naomi's a widow. And now the two sons have died. That's really important because that means that this line, that family, is coming to an end. There's no room for them anymore at all. And so Naomi is looking at maybe, I'll go back home. And Ruth goes with her. One of the daughter-in-laws stayed in Moab. But we remember that famous line that we read this morning, or John read for us, and I appreciate John reading for me this morning. Wherever you go, I'm going to go. And wherever you die, I will die and be buried there. Now stop and think about that. This is a woman from Moab who's saying, if you go back to Israel, to Judah, and you die there, I will stay there and I will die there. That means I will be buried away from my home and family, my real home and family. And she's saying, I'm telling you that my family is you. And so she's giving up everything that she has. And we all remember that story, and that's usually where it ends, right there, Naomi and Ruth. But what's Ruth's real claim to fame? Do you remember? Ruth's real claim to fame is that she is David's great-grandmother. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And the women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz. That's the first important point. Boaz the father of Obed. Obed the father of Jesse. And Jesse the father of David. The reason this is important is because if the line had died with Ahimelech and his sons, there would be no direct line for Jesus to be born. Because Jesus was out of the house of David. David hasn't been born yet. He couldn't have been out of that line if it hadn't have been for the fact that we had the guardian redeemer in Boaz. And I'll explain that a little bit in just a little bit. These are the important things about Ruth that we need to remember. God used a Gentile woman to ensure the Savior of the world would be in the line of Judah, in the house of David, just like he promised. Now, Ruth was probably the most unlikely woman for him to use. He could have used any Israelite woman to do that, but he managed to do it through a Moabite woman. Again, Ruth didn't have any special skills, but she did have some special qualities. And the first of those qualities is courage. The dictionary tells us that courage is the ability to do something that frightens one, bravery, or strength in the face of pain or grief. Now remember, Ruth is a widow. She's probably still grieving at the time Naomi decides to go back to Bethlehem. Now, the official grieving time was a year. But people who have lost loved ones know that sometimes 20, 30, 40 years later, a day will come when it just pops in your head and the grief is just as fresh as it's ever been. So Ruth is both of these things. I want you to stop and think about what Ruth is about to do. Here she is way down here in Moab, probably near that capital city. And there are 2 ways that you can get to Bethlehem. Now, you can go across the Dead Sea, and it's about 30 or 40 miles, like the crow flies across there. But most of the time, people didn't go that way. A sea voyage was to be avoided at any cost because storms came up and people got killed that way. So you can go down around the bottom and come up that way, or you can go up around the top and go the other way. Either way, it's a distance of about 80 to 100 miles, and walking, it takes about 7 to 10 days to do that. Now, that's if you can just walk straight there. Most of the time, people would not come out of Moab and go down through Edom. Edom are the sons of Esau, and they hated the Israelites. And so you just didn't go that way because those people didn't like you and they'd kill you. So they went up around the other way to Bethlehem. You can see Bethlehem way over there under Jerusalem. And I want you to notice they had to cross 1, 2, 3, 4 rivers to get there. Now, back in 1000 BC, crossing a river was a big deal. Put yourself in the position of Naomi and Ruth. You've got 2 widow women. And they're going to cover that distance walking more than likely. Now, they probably attached themselves to a group. No ifs, ands, or buts about that. But even so, just stop and think about crossing that landscape. Even if they did go fairly easily and fairly directly, they would have to be going down in these green valleys in order to get there. There's no way to go up and down, and travel all that distance in that kind of topography. But that's what they had all the way around. And if you'll notice, these are the foothills. You've got mountains in the back. And they had to get over those somehow. Stop and thinking about being two single women with no man to protect you in 1000 BC making this trip. How many of you men would make it today on foot by yourself? You talk about courage. That took courage. Not only that, Ruth is a Moabite. She's going to leave her homeland and go to this strange place. I don't think Ruth had ever been to Bethlehem before, do you? The only thing in Bethlehem that she had lost there was Naomi, who was her mother-in-law. Now stop and think about this. Here's the golden opportunity, ladies, to get rid of your mother-in-law. She says, I'm going back to Bethlehem. I said, well, tough luck, we'll see you. And good riddance. But that's not what Ruth did. Ruth stuck by Naomi, her mother-in-law. What about her mother? What about her father? What about any other family she might have had? I mean, it's totally unlikely that she didn't have any family at all in Moab. It took a lot of courage for Ruth to do what she did. But then the other thing, I don't think so, that Ruth had was commitment. When you look at the dictionary definitions of commitment, all three of these apply to Ruth. She made an agreement or a pledge to do something in the future. She pledged something at that particular time, and she was in a state of being obligated because of emotions. She loved Naomi. How many of you don't have to raise your hands. In fact, don't. We don't want to know this. How many of you really love your mother-in-law? I was one of those fortunate people that had a mother-in-law I could love, and I did. She was the greatest thing on earth. But those are unusual. And I think it was probably unusual in that time as well. As John read to us, Ruth replied to Naomi when Naomi said, you need to just stay here. This is your home. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and this is the important one, and your God will be my God. Think about Ruth giving up her religion for her mother-in-law and saying, your God will be my God. That's a big deal. It's a big deal for anyone. Some of you are sitting here in this audience this morning and are estranged from your family simply because you chose to be here. That you chose God over a relationship with them. Now, they were the ones that really made the choice because they put it to you that way. But some of you know this feeling intimately of giving up your family, your gods, your people. And then Ruth went on to say that wherever you die, I will die, and I'll be buried there. And may your Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even death separates you and me. But then when I look at commitment, I also think about the courage that it took for Ruth to go to the threshing floor. Now, some of you may not remember this story, and this is a really weird situation. The whole guardian redeemer thing is an odd thing. I wish I understood everything I know about it. But basically, it boils down to this. Male relatives can marry the widows in order to redeem the land that belonged to the dead man and keep the family name going, especially in a situation like with Ahimelech and the two boys, where all of them were dead and the family line is coming to an end. Now, Boaz is in line to be a guardian redeemer for Ruth and Naomi. There's another person that's closer. And in fairness, Boaz goes to the person and says, you've got first dibs. If you want to marry this gal to get the land, you can do it. What'd the guy say? Oh, I'll do it. Yeah, give me the land, give me the land. But then he said, by the way, though, she's a Moabitess, and you've got to marry this woman in order to make this happen. And the guy said, well, now, I can't do that. That'll mess up my inheritance for my own kids. You marry her. So Boaz did. Now, I don't know what Boaz's situation was, but I do know this. Ruth told Naomi, if you tell me to go lay down on the threshing floor and have this man take me as a wife, I'll do it. Now, daughters, how many of you would do this if your mother-in-law said, I want you to marry this guy over here so that I can keep the land in the family? I got women out here shaking their heads no all over the place. That's how committed Ruth was. But stop and think about the courage that it took for a widow to go into an unmarried man in public at night in a situation that would be construed as risky under any circumstances, and do that as a part of the ritual of guardian redeemership. See, the way it was done was when the man would go to sleep at night, the woman would come in, lift up the bedclothes, and lay down at his feet. And when he woke up in the morning, surprise, surprise, there she was. Of course, everyone's thinking, well, what else went on during the night besides surprise, surprise? And so she completely ruined her reputation if he refused her. But she was so committed to Naomi that Ruth was willing to do this. She had the courage to go in and do it, and she had the commitment to go in and do it. But there's one other thing that Ruth had, and that's charisma. Now, when we think about charisma, we think about powerful self-help leaders and stuff like that. Cult leaders that get people to follow them blindly without even thinking about what they're doing. But the dictionary tells us it is simply a compelling attractiveness or charm that can inspire devotion in others. But it's also, and this is what you probably didn't know, a divinely conferred power or talent. First thing that Boaz did when he went into the field the day that Ruth was out gleaning behind the regular harvesters was say, hi, how y'all doing? That's what he was doing when he said, the Lord be with you, and they said, the Lord bless you. You know, that exchange. And they all said, hi, how are you doing back? And he said, who's that woman? Now, I don't know if he said anything else, but that's what the Bible reports, is that he said, hi, how are you doing, and who's that woman? Well, that woman had something about her that compelled him to look at her and take notice of her. It could have been God divinely intervening. And I like to think that it was. But there was also something about Ruth. And when Boaz went to talk to her, what did he say about her? I've heard nothing but good things about you. So we already knew a little something about her. And then he saw her, and of course he was just smitten. How many of y'all have been smitten before? You know, love at first sight. Most of us don't believe in it, but it happens all the time. And so here's the situation that we've got with Ruth. She has a certain charisma about her. She has an attractiveness that makes people want to be with her and to do things for her. What I want you to notice is if you back up in that story, before Boaz saw her and before he even came to the field, when he got there, he said, "Who's that woman?" And the field master, the foreman, said, "Oh, that's Ruth the Moabitess. And she came here and said, 'Let me glean in your field.' And so I said, 'Okay.'" Well, when you look at the gleaning process, you had to have an in to be able to do that. In order to glean, it meant that you were so poor that you couldn't produce food for yourself. And so you were allowed to go back and pick up the leavings behind the regular harvesters. And that's what this foreman allowed Ruth to do. Now, she had no real connection with this family other than a distant connection. And so these are the three traits that all great leaders have: courage, commitment, and charisma. They don't necessarily do the work, but they surround themselves with people who can do it, and they're willing to do it for them. We've all had bosses that we liked so much that we were willing to do work for them, maybe extra work that we wouldn't do under any other circumstances. We became committed to them because of that. It was because they had already had the courage and the commitment to whatever the project was that we were working on. The commitment to us as an individual. And God's reflecting his own attributes to us through Ruth, because God had the courage to send his son. You ever stop to think about that? God didn't just wake up one morning and say, "I think I'll send my son and let him die on a cross." What parent in this audience would be willing to do that? Took a lot of courage. But God was committed to redeeming us. He was committed to saving us. He had already planned before the world was ever born that if things didn't go according to his original plan of living in harmony and peace and happiness with human beings forever, that he already had another way in mind. And of course, God has charisma. He draws us to him through his son. And so I want you to think about it this morning. No matter how unlikely you think you may be, you have a place in God's plan. You are important. He needs you. He wants you. All you have to do is just trust him, believe in him, and do what he asks you to do. All he wants for you is for you to live a healthy life, a happy life, and live in peace. Anyone here want to raise your hand and say, "No, I don't want to live that way"? But if you do want to live that way, part of that is committing to God. And we do that through baptism. If you've never done it before, that's how you publicly declare I'm going to live for Jesus. It may very well have been that you've already made that public commitment, but you haven't lived up to it. We have an avenue to come back to God and be reconciled with Him this morning, this minute, while together we stand and sing.